Well, good morning, everybody. Good morning. Sure appreciate everybody getting here this morning. Welcome to session 4 of Man to Man, which, as you guys can see on your handout, is all about Dad. You know, a little over a year ago, I lost my dad, or he'd be sitting right here in the front row. We got a little picture of him for you guys that remember my dad. And because today's all about Dad, I thought I'd tell you a little story about me and my dad. You know, we always lived out in the country. My dad loved that. In fact, we laughed that as soon as they paved the street that we lived on, we should start packing because Dad's going to move us farther out. And out in the country, it was great. It was just me and my brother and my mom and dad. And it's a great thing for boys. We had animals and we had horses. And my dad decided one day that we needed a cow. Not sure why we needed a cow, but we got a cow. And what we found out real quick was the fencing requirements of cows and horses are radically different. Horses will kind of respect whatever fence you put them in, and cows will not. That's how barbed wire got invented. So we put this cow in this corral that had been holding our horses, and the cow would just lean up against it and bust a board off, and he'd take off, and then the horses would take off, and we'd have to have this neighborhood roundup. And this went on for a while. Clearly it was a problem. And if you knew my dad was a problem solver. So my dad went down to the co-op, and the guy down there said, all right, this is what you need. And he came back home. He was so excited, called my brother and I over and said, pulled out of the back of his trunk. He pulls this box out, and it says on there, electric fence kit. And he's like, this is the latest thing. We're going to put this up. So we did. We put the fence up, plugged it in, turned it on. Nothing really happens. The light comes on, but we waited. And didn't have to wait long. That ornery cow got over there and tried to bust the fence. As soon as he did, man, bang, hit that electric fence, gave a big moo, and we were just laughing and high-fiving or whatever we did back then. My dad was like, problem solved. And we all thought that was it until one day I came home from school and found the cows were gone and the horses were gone and the fence was busted. And we had to do a neighborhood roundup. So my dad called down to the co-op and told them what happened. They said, well, you got to check that fence every day because sometimes they just stop working for whatever reason. And you need to check it and just make sure that it's working. And so my dad's like, all right, great, that's fine. So he's thinking, that's a problem. Hey, Roy, that's my brother. Roy, Russell, come here. I got this thing fixed. Every morning, when you guys head off down to the bus stop, y'all going to take turns. And one of y'all is going to touch that fence. And if it shocks you, no problem. Fence is working great. If it doesn't, we got to figure out what's wrong, fix it before the cow figures out it's not working. And so this went on. He solved the problem. And of course, when you're ready to touch that fence, we weren't in a real hurry to get to the bus stop. So this went on for days, weeks, months maybe. When you're getting that much electroshock therapy, time is a little fuzzy. But it went on long enough that one day I'm down at the co-op with my dad. He was getting something, and I always loved going in there and wandering around. Those places smell good. They smell like grain and leather, and there's cool stuff everywhere. I was about 7, so I didn't know what most of it was, but I was reading a little bit. So I was just going down the aisles, and I found this item, and I looked at it, and I kind of thought I read what I read, and then I read it again. I kind of got excited, and I went up to the clerk, and I said, is this what it says it is? And he looked at it, and he went, electric fence tester. Yeah? I said, well, does it work? He said, oh, it works great. You just stick this wire in the ground, touch the light to the fence, and if it's working, it lights up. If it's not, your fence isn't working. I went, oh, man, that's so good. We need one of those. How much is that? He turns it over, and goes, $1. $1? Man, I started digging in my pockets, whatever coins and candy money, and put it all up there. He took whatever he needed, and I ran so excited to my dad, Dad, look what I bought, look what I bought. And my dad, kind of went, what? And he kind of took this thing and looked, and he goes, electric fence tester. Huh, is that what that is? Hell, one of those came in a box. You guys welcome Robert Lewis.
Well, good morning, guys, and welcome to Man to Man Session 4. And if you look on your outline, it's entitled The Dad Factor. The Dad Factor. For us as men, this is probably what I call an emotionally charged, critically important subject that it's good to talk about today as we turn the corner from looking back now to looking into the future, because all of us, or at least most of us in the room, we're probably a dad or will be a dad in the future. And of course, all of us are sons here today, so this subject is timely for us. So I want to start with this question. Why is dad so important? The best answer I've ever gotten was one that I saw in Newsweek magazine some years back. And here's what it said. There was a cover page and a picture of a dad with his sons and daughters. And then next to the quote was this headline that said, "Dad is destiny." Dad is destiny. And here's what the quote said. It said, "Science shows a dad's chromosomes determine the sex of every baby, boy or girl. But far more important is modern research that shows that a man's presence in his family is the main factor in determining whether his little boy will have healthy masculine traits and his little girl healthy feminine ones." Dad is destiny. Now, I remember when I read that quote, I remember two phrases jumped off the page. And those two phrases were these. One, Dad's presence. And then secondly, is the main factor. Dad's presence is the main factor. In other words, whether you know it or not, when you walked in here this morning, we guys carry unbelievable influence in society today. We're far more influential than we could ever imagine, because much of what shapes the society in which we live, or the future of society, is whether you and I are good at depositing healthy energy into the next generation. This, just like the quote, is the fixed law of God or nature or both. Best-selling author David Blankenhorn writes in his book on fatherhood these words: "As a father, the good family man is not perfect." And we're not, are we? I mean, we're riddled with flaws, all of us. But that's okay. But Blankenhorn goes on and says this: "But he is good enough to be absolutely irreplaceable. He is the father on the premises. He knows that nothing can substitute for him. Nothing. He would never consider himself not that important to his children, because he knows, in fact, he is essential." The dad factor. The Old Testament, makes the same point in an odd kind of way. Now, when you look at the Old Testament, what you see in the Old Testament is a book which is really a compilation of books that were assembled over thousands of years. And they tell the story of God's dealings with the Jews, if you've read the Old Testament, but they also talk about His dealings, His promises, His blessings to all of mankind. But the Old Testament then ends in this odd way in the last book of the Old Testament, which is the book of Malachi. So how does it end? What you would expect if you were just reading the Old Testament, 39 books over hundreds of pages, is that when you come to the end of Malachi and his final words, kind of like the final words of any great novel, there would be some explosive final word about God. Our God is the God of all. Amen. That's how the Old Testament, you would expect, should end. In some ways, that is how the New Testament ends. It ends with a final pronouncement when it says, "The grace of the Lord Jesus be with you all. Amen." That's how the book of Revelation ends. But in the Old Testament, when you come to the end, you don't have this grand finale about God. In fact, the last statement of the Old Testament is about dads. It finishes kind of odd with a final statement pointed at us as dads. Here's what Malachi 4:6 says as that prophet wraps up the Old Testament. He says, God wants, listen very carefully, God wants the hearts of fathers to be restored to their children, and the hearts of children to be restored to their fathers. Otherwise, God will smite the land. with a curse. Amen. That's how the Old Testament finishes. Isn't that kind of odd? It finishes talking to us as fathers. And the question is, why? I think because, in a supernatural kind of way, the prophet understood that dads were essential to any society. And if dads are disconnected from their families, then what envelops over time, sometimes a very short period of time, is a curse. Curse as in family breakdown, family breakups. Curse as in problematic, troubled kids who become problematic, troubled adults. Drug and alcohol problems. The prison explosion. An abundance of greed. An outbreak of racism, violence, murder, rape, sexual assault, domestic abuse, and social unrest. All those come under this big heading, cursed. So the Old Testament ends with a warning. And it's a profound warning. And here's what it is. It is either good dads or a bad society. One or the other. This is the way life works. This is the law of God. And so at a foundation level, every society, at the foundation, bottom line of every society is a father. Research says that, social research, modern social research says that. Our enduring wisdom of the ages, the Bible says that. Dad is destiny. He's not optional. Dad is essential. So what we want to do this morning in session 4 is take a look at us as dads. And I want to introduce you here at the beginning to a concept called the smart dad. The smart dad. And I call him the smart dad because he has assets that a lot of other dads don't have. By the way, let me just see a show of hands. How many of you guys are dads here today? Let's just see your hands. Okay, everybody look around. This probably represents maybe 1,500 to 2,000 kids that are going to be launched into the future. No doubt, every guy that just raised his hand, wants to be a good dad. In all the years I've ever worked with men, I've never found a dad who came up to me and said this, my goal is to really screw up my kid. I want him to be a vacuum of values. I want him to be a misfit. I want him to be a troublemaker. I want him to be toxically selfish and go out and just create chaos in the next generation. I've never met a dad like that. In fact, no matter who the dad is, whether I'm talking to a group of prisoners or CEOs, every dad wants to be a good dad. But here's what I've observed over the years about dads. Lots of dads try hard and do the best they know how to be a father. But oftentimes, their good intentions, their hard work, their best effort fails to get the long-term results they wanted with their son or their daughter. They work hard. You work hard. You have good intentions. You want things to turn out right. But what we're seeing in society today is, for most dads, things aren't turning out so good. And the big question for us this morning is why? Why does that happen? You might want to jot this one phrase down. If you don't remember anything else, you can remember this one. Here's what it is. It's because when it comes to being a dad, okay? When it comes to being a dad, good effort may not be smart effort. All your investments may be amiss in some way that you're not aware of. And so all that effort may not be smart effort. You can try hard. You can do what you think is best. And let me tell you, I've met with so many fathers like this. You can do all that and still miss delivering to your son or daughter some of life's most important assets. So what do? Well, my answer this morning to you is you become what I call the smart dad. Because the smart dad has two things two critical things that other dads don't. Here's what they are. First, he has an intentional plan. He has an intentional plan. He doesn't live by just a general spontaneous rule of fathering, which most of us, if we're not careful, do. We just kind of have this general thing, on-the-spot fathering that we kind of make up or erupt with, but it has no order. It has no discipline. It has no goals. It's just being a dad on the premises who just responds to his kids. It's a general plan. But the intentional dad has a very specific plan. In fact, I think it's really helpful for a dad with an intentional plan to actually have some of that written out in a simple kind of way. The reason I tell you that is because years ago, when I became a father, when I was having those little rugrats around me and trying to figure out how I'm going to bring them up, I sat down with some others and worked on and came up with an intentional plan. Now, it's very simple, because I'm simple. But it was at least something that was written down that I could follow and give attention to. It's something I could track my progress with because it was written out. It was something that gave me something to think about every year so I could kind of guide my fatherhood by it. And I found it not only helpful to me, but over time, I found it helpful to some other dads as well in raising their boys and their daughters. This will be both, but I'm going to lean a little bit towards the sons here this morning. But it was an intentional plan that was helpful. In fact, I've got the intentional plan for you today. And so on your table, there is a manila envelope that says, "Do not open." The table leaders can open it and pass it around, and we'll take a look at the plan that I operated off of for some 20 years. Okay? So you might just take it out. Everybody can have a copy. We'll put it up here on the screen. And one of the things you're going to notice when you open up this plan is it's talking about sons, but let me tell you, except for a few things on this sheet, this is the plan that I also used with my daughters as well. So this could work both ways with a few adjustments, but that's the plan that you have as you pass it around. And for you young guys, let me tell you, I was so excited when I got up this morning because I thought there are some guys out here who are going to have, they're expecting their first child, or maybe they already have a child or a couple of children, who are 2, 3, 5, 7. Boy, if there was ever a time to have an intentional plan, it's this morning. So I got up this morning excited to give this plan to you. Now the rest of us, we're going to have to pick it up somewhere along the timeline. But I want to walk through this plan with you here this morning and let you see how this simple plan works. So let's take a look at it. First thing you're going to notice is right over here on the left-hand side, the 4 key needs of a son or daughter. Okay? The smart dad knows, listen, the smart dad knows that his son or daughter has 4 primary needs. He knows that they need to see certain things in dad. They know, the dad knows that his children need to receive some special things from dad. He knows that they need to experience some memory-making experiences with dad. And finally, the smart dad knows his children need to hear some heartfelt things out of dad. That's what's listed here with a couple of specific breakouts under each one of those major headings. Now look across the top, because as we go across the top, we go from 1 to 21, and those are primarily the years that a child is at home, although with this millennial crowd, some of us are pushing that out a little further. Basement is getting all warmed up with a couch and that kind of thing. But normally between 1 and 21 is when you're at home. And so these are the years that a child, a son or daughter, is under dad's tutelage and shepherding and those kind of things. And then what you see underneath those years are some stars. Every category, by the way, is important. But you see some stars, some circles, and a few notes. And what that represents under each one of those years is some special emphases that you need to make during that particular year as you go down that column, or where there's a special opportunity where you can extra invest in your son or daughter around that need. That's the plan. And as you notice, it's on one sheet of paper for 21 years, so it's pretty simple. So the plan has basically 2 key features. The 4 needs on the left, And then the years to give some attention, some places extra attention, some special emphasis to those 4 needs. So I'm going to walk down each one of them so I can kind of define these for you and you can get a feel for them because each one is very important. So for instance, under C, look at C there. You have 2 things, dad's character and dad loving mom. The smart dad knows that his character is essential in raising his children. Because here's what the smart dad knows. He knows his children will leave with what they've seen dad live out in the home. Not what dad said. Not necessarily what dad even taught or how he corrected. But dad is a 24-hour movie and a son or daughter is drinking that movie in all the time. And what they see in dad is what they're going to leave home with. Which is a little bit scary, isn't it, guys? Because let me tell you, for a child, there are no private spaces with dad. You may think as a dad there are some private spaces, but your son or daughter has radar and they can hear what's going on in the next room. They can catch you at night late on a computer. They can do all those things and pick up where their dad's character is consistent. They'll see noble things in dads that they'll just drink in and want to emulate, or they may see hypocrisy, or they may see inconsistencies that then disturb the development of their soul before they leave home. But here's what you need to know. Your son or daughter is going to leave with what they saw lived out in your character. The Proverbs, the wisdom literature of the Bible, is very clear on that. Here's what it says, from a good perspective. It says, the man who walks in his integrity, or we could even say it this way, the dad who walks in his integrity, how blessed are his sons after him. Because when they leave home with a moral sturdiness and emotional stability that many of their classmates and friends don't have. But it's because of what they saw at home. Secondly, the category is dad loving mom. You might want to jot this down. I read this somewhere, but it makes so much sense to me now looking back, and that's this. 75% of all good parenting is just one thing. One thing. A good marriage. So all the things we do to make our kids right outside of that are helpful, but really in the end, what your son or daughter is seeing in how you love your wife and she loves you, how you communicate, how you solve problems, how you deal with stress and all that is a giant parenting seminar. And if there's love and closeness, even when there's difficulty and anger at times and conflict, but if you're working through those things, that is the best parenting workshop you can ever give your son or daughter. So the encouragement to you, and when we think about the smart dad, is never stop investing in your marriage. Ever. In fact, if you've been married 10, 20 years, this is the best time to do a refresher course. Whether it's getting a group of guys and talking about marriage just to kind of upgrade your marriage skills at this season of life, whether it's going to some seminar that's in town or away or whatever, you need to continually upgrade your skills in marriage, because marriage is really a series of marriages. Somebody called, a psychologist called it serial monogamy. You're in one season, just about the time you're figuring out, marriage transitions to the next, from no kids to kids, then to teenage kids, then to empty nest, and on. And you need to stay up with the times so that your marriage is healthy. But all marriages have all kinds of obstacles and question marks that can only be overcome if you as a husband are investing in your wife. Because when kids see dad loving mom, communicating with mom, doing the right things with mom, they're becoming really healthy. That's what they need to see. Secondly, what they need to receive. I put some things under there. First of all, affirming encouragement. The smart dad will listen guys, let everybody look at it. The smart dad will major on cheerleading. The problem with so many dads, and the Scripture addresses this in several places, is that most dads lean to being a head coach and critical. And yet, for a child, especially as they move into their teenage years, when they're a little bit insecure, what they need most from dad is not, if you'd have done this, you'd have scored 5 more points. What they need to hear is, you played a great game. Or let me tell you what I really admire in you. Or let me encourage you, or let's have fun together, because what a boy or girl needs to see is dad cheering them on in life. You have a period where you can be a coach. It's usually when they're preteen, but when they turn teenagers, and that's why I've listed some stars there on affirming encouragement. Once they get a little older, they need for you to be cheering for them. Cheering for them. Because that's what a good dad does. Manhood instruction. Somewhere along the line, a dad's got to enter into his child's life, especially his son's life, and begin to give him some clarity. We'll talk about this next week, but every son needs from you a definition of manhood. What does it mean to be a man? That needs to be something that's clear, that you can call him to. He needs to know about the world of girls. And what better person to hear that from than from your dad, where maybe a group of dads and teenage sons are just talking about for a few weeks the world of girls, or how to connect with God, or how to handle money, how to show up on time for a job, just basic life skills. Those are the things that really make the difference in a son or daughter's life, where they start feeling competent rather than incompetent. By the way, nothing makes a son angrier than to feel like he's not competent for life. But dad can give away skills to get his son ahead in that regard. Then Jesus in his life. Somewhere along the line, you got to talk, what is this life all about? And for some of you guys, maybe you're not even sure spiritually. We can talk more about that later. But one of the great assets is to be able, as a dad, to actually have intimate spiritual discussions with your son or daughter. To pray with them. To talk about what God's doing in my life. To be able to share wisdom from the Scriptures. You know, that's an unbelievable gift that I wish every guy in the room could have. And many of you do have that. Then under experience, I mentioned special one-on-one times. You know, one of the things psychologists and counselors will tell you is that when you get to be older, as an adult, as a son, let's say looking back, one of the things that stabilizes you is to have great memories from your childhood. And those come from great experiences. I remember walking into a businessman's office one day, and you know, he's very successful, and he had this little tiny beat up frame picture on his credenza. And I got up close and looked at it, and it was a picture of him as a little boy standing next to his dad, and they'd been out hunting. And so I just made the comment. I said, that's you and your dad? And he said, yeah. I said, so you guys were out hunting? I said, I bet you enjoyed that a lot. And he said, no, not a lot. We only did it once my whole life. Do you hear the message there? One time. He said, but it was a great day. So here he is, 60 years old, in his big office, with his beautiful credenza, with a beat up little metal frame. And what's on there? A memory that makes him feel good about life. And it was him and his dad. You know, in your little diagram there, you'll notice when a child turns into a teenager, it's really good to think about every year. It's a good discipline. It was a good discipline for me every year to think, I need to have some great experience with every one of my kids. Most of the time, just them and me. You know, they can be big memories. You can take them to some big football game or on some great fishing trip. I remember taking Mason mountain climbing. Never do it again, but I took him mountain climbing. But man, we had a great experience up there, you know. But when I asked him one day what some of his great memories were of growing up, you know what he told me? Because sometimes they can be small things. He said, well, one of my great memories is when you came to school and checked me out, and I thought I was in trouble. It was in the middle of the day, and so we checked out, and you got in the car, and you said, Mason, let's go bowling. So we spent the whole afternoon just bowling together. That was one of his great memories, just being with Dad. Your kids need great experiences with you going through life. Then manhood ceremonies. I've actually targeted some manhood ceremonies. We'll talk more about that in a minute, but if you'll look on there's no rite of passages in America today for manhood. And so I created some. One starting at 13, where I introduced my boys to what it meant to be a man, gave them a specific definition. Then when they were 16, about to get a car, we did a big ceremony around getting the car where we got the friends together, and all these guys spoke into my son's life about what they liked about him. And then I got to stand up and say something to Garrett and to Mason about what I admired in them. That was at 16. Then I gave them the keys to the car and said, it's a new day for you. Then at 18, before they went off to college, we had a rite of passage ceremony where we got friends together and commissioned them of going off because now they were kind of on their own for the first time. We spoke life into them and blessed them. And then at 21, we kind of had this finale where we commissioned them as being a man. All those little markers along the way are missing in American culture today. But let me tell you guys, if you do that, it's amazing what it does. One of the things I have on my finger is a ring. It's a manhood ring that all both my boys got when they turned 21, just to remind them about what manhood is all about. Those kind of ceremonies, that's a smart dad being intentional with his kids. And then notice lastly, under here, I've just listed 3 phrases every child needs to hear from dad. And they need to hear it a lot. I never heard it. But they need to hear this. I love, and this, by the way, this is not just, hey, love you, son. No, I'm not talking about that kind of talk. I'm talking about up close, hands on shoulders, looking deep into his face and eyes and saying, you know what? I want you to know I really love you. Or at some appropriate point, getting close to your son and saying, son, I am really proud of you. And then even getting more specific at times and getting next to your son and say, you know, maybe it's just a private moment. Say, let me tell you what I admire in you. And then list a few specific things that you have noticed in them that you admire and complimenting them and maybe even talking about that's going to be a huge asset for you in the future. By the way, did you know that when you read the New Testament and God the Father speaks to God the Son, the only recorded message of God the Father to God the Son, He said these 3 things. That's all He ever said. He did it several times in Jesus' life. There would be this moment where all of a sudden the heavens would open, according to the Scripture, and there would be a voice that said this. Out loud, everybody heard it, including Jesus, but Jesus the Son needed it. It would say this, the voice would say from heaven. This is my beloved Son. Imagine Jesus. Here He is, wrestling through an earthly existence. In other words, this is my beloved Son. I love Him. In whom I am well pleased. What does that say? I'm proud of you. And then it says to the audience, listen to Him. Because He's really good at what He's saying. And if Jesus needed that, let me tell you what I found about dads. Your son or daughter needs that straight up from you. They don't need to hear it on the side. They don't need to hear it say when you're waving goodbye to them, love you. No. They need heart-to-heart communication that communicates these phrases over and over again so there's no doubt by the time they leave home that they are deeply loved by you, that you are immensely proud of them. And they know from your lips what they're good at. That's the plan. So the first thing I think a smart dad has is not a general parenting style, but and you can do whatever you want, but a specific parenting style with an intentional plan with specifics involved in it that hopefully are written out. So, when your child turns 11, you can look down the column and you can say, I need to be doing these things this year. Or when he's 18, I need to be doing these things. You just have something that's intentional. And let me tell you, that makes a huge difference in your parenting style as a dad. And then secondly, the smart dad needs disciplined follow-through. He knows a good plan is only that, a plan. He also knows that parenting hell is a road paved with good intentions. It's where you hear something like this today and go, man, I need to do stuff like that. I need to speak into my son's life or daughter's life. I need to have a plan. I need to do some ceremonies. We need to have some special experiences. And every year you keep reminding yourself of that, but life is going so fast with such frenzy that one day you look up and they're 18 and they're going to college. And you realize a lot of the things that you intended to do weren't done. That spiritual discussion you'd love to have with your son or daughter about God, you never had that. Never did even a Bible study of any kind or bless them, never had a ceremony, and they're gone. And you end up in that category of a lot of dads who then feel this incredible loss. And they'll tell me over and over again, I missed it. I just simply missed it. I've found that discipline follow-through works best when you at least have one other dad you can commit to, that you can hold him accountable and he can hold you. Just spur one another along, because other dads tend to be kind of difference makers in follow-through. That certainly was true for me. In fact, years ago when my boys, my girls were just, they were 7 or so and under, I was with some other dads and we talked about this, and we made a commitment at that time to raise our kids. Our kids didn't really match up, but just as dads, we made a commitment that we would hold each other accountable. Ultimately, I ended up writing a book about it. It was called Raising a Modern Day Knight. And some of you may have read that book. But if you ever wanted to take more of what I'm saying today and see it played out, it would be in a book like this, where I go through how we did all these things intentionally. But having these dads, Bill Wellens and Bill Parkins, in my life with our 7 sons, every year we would talk about how we're doing. Every year we'd call ourselves to have experiences with our boys individually, not necessarily always together. Although every year, starting way back then, we'd take a duck hunt together, and just finished taking I don't know, Bill could tell you today, maybe our 22nd duck hunt this year. Every year we take a duck hunt with those boys. But we intentionally invested in them. We intentionally had ceremonies. 7 sons, 4 ceremonies each. We did 28 ceremonies over the years that they were growing up. But it happened not in isolation, guys. It happened because there were some other dads just stimulating one another to get the job done, and not to be a generalist dad, but to be a smart dad. So what the smart dad has that other dads don't are 2 things: an intentional plan and a disciplined follow-through. And here's what I can tell you, looking at my kids and my other friends' kids. It worked. It really did work. And I've seen it in a lot of other dads as well. But the point is this: good kids don't just happen. They don't just happen. They are the result of a good plan and disciplined follow-through. Now, having said that, let me address 2 big issues that would come up in an audience like this, especially with some of the older guys in the room. But I just want to mention these because these are important as we transition to, from this point on, looking into the future as men. But we're finishing up kind of in transition between the past and the future here. But there's 2 big issues that come up about fathering. Here's the first one, and it concerns the dad who thinks he has missed it. Maybe you're in the audience today and you go, my son's 25 years old or 30 years old, and we didn't connect like that. Here's what I want you to know. If you're a dad who has had a problem with your son, here's what you need to know. You need to know it's never too late to close the gap, no matter how old your son is. No matter how old he is. I can still remember, this was probably 15 years ago, after a dad talk, a gentleman walked up to me. He was a lawyer in town, and he was kind of crestfallen because his son was grown. His son was actually in medical school up at Harvard. And he just told me how he and his son never connected. That he worked all the time, that there was a lot of distance between them, and unrest. His son had pulled away, really related to mom real well, but didn't relate to him at all. And so he kind of poured out his heart to me. He said, I mean, he's finishing his residency at Harvard, and he doesn't want anything to do with me. So how would you answer a dad like that? Here's what I said. I said, you know, Charlie, I am so sorry. But you know what? It's never too late. So here's what let's do. Let's go get you a plane ticket, and let's fly you to Harvard. And before you leave, you call your son and say, let's go out and have dinner together. He said, I couldn't do that. I said, what's holding you back? And of course, there really wasn't anything. He just needed another man to encourage him, so he did it. And he flew up there. And he took his son out to dinner that night. And they sat at the dinner table kind of awkwardly, and he said, you know, I've been learning some things. And then he just said it. I've made a lot of mistakes. And I want us to have a relationship. And then he said, and I want you to know how much I love you. And I'm proud of you. And here's what I've admired. He just used the script. That's all he did. Us simpletons, you know, we got to have that. So he did that and interacted with his son. And his son kind of broke the ice. His son kind of started interacting with him. And then he got on the plane the next day and flew home. When he got home, his wife was there. And she said, our son called me last night after dinner. He said, he did? I said, yeah, he did. Well, what did he say? He said, Mom, I just had the finest day of my life. Because let me tell you, the hearts of sons and daughters are always wanting to turn towards Dad. They just need Dad to make a pathway to get there. And this man's humility to engage his son was the big difference maker. And from that point on, their relationship was significantly changed to the better. So here's what I want you to know. If you're a guy like that here today, I just want you to know it is never too late. Say it with me. It's never too late. Let's say it again a little louder. It's never too late. It's never too late to close the gap with your son or your daughter. Ever. Here's the second thing. Second issue. For dads who might feel overwhelmed. If you're a single dad through divorce or death, or a dad who's joined a blended family, let me tell you, that can just overwhelm you. That's uncharted waters. But don't despair. Instead, seek outside help and wisdom to build a sound parenting strategy for going forward. But the one thing you don't want to do if you've gone through a divorce, or your wife died and you were left with these kids, or you've joined a family where there's 2 or 3 kids that aren't yours and you're going, what do I do? The last thing you want to do, guys, is guess at it. You don't want to guess at it. So I want to give you 3 things you can do. Here's the first. Read, read, read. And us guys are not good at reading. Okay, so we're going to step in some uncharted waters, and you're going to say, I'm in this place where I don't know what to do. Well, the best way to start is just get a good book that you can read that begins to map out the land that you're in. I'll mention 2 real quickly here. There's Ron Deal's book, Dr. Ron Deal. If you're in a step family, he's got a book that's a great book with great practical principles called The Smart Step Family. And then if you're just a single parent through divorce or death, Dr. Kevin Lehman is a great author with tremendous insight into the dynamics of a family, and he wrote the book, Single Parenting That Works. Either one of those books would be a great starting place if you find yourself in this category, but you got to read, guys. At least one book you got to read. Secondly, it's really helpful to talk to other families, to other dads who find themselves in the same situation. So look around and find a dad who's gone through these events of death or divorce or a blended family, and if they seem to be doing well, then go interview them. Just talk to them. Get a cup of coffee, and in an hour-long conversation, you'll find a lot of interesting bits of information that will be helpful to you as you start your adventure there. One, they'll tell you about mistakes they made that you need to avoid. You can write those down. They'll also tell you about things that worked. So what you're really doing in the interview is getting best practices. And you can add that to your resume and use that, in the situation that you find yourself in. But whatever you do, don't guess at it. And then the last thing is this, especially if you've been divorced. Maybe you just need to humble yourself and go to your kids and ask forgiveness to repair the relationship. I had one gentleman who came up to me and he was all frustrated because he'd worked with his kids and he'd been divorced. He left mom when the kids were like 12 and 13, and the kids had really backed off of him, felt a lot of hostility towards him. He tried to buy them things, do things for them, give them gifts, take them places and stuff, but the relationship never warmed up. It was always cool. And he was expressing that to me. I just can't get through to those kids. And so I asked him, I said, well, Bill, let me ask you this. Have you ever told your kids that you were sorry you left mom? Well, I don't know if I am sorry. Well, I understand that. I know it's a volatile relationship or you wouldn't have left. But here's the point. For them, was it good that you left? And he said, no. I said, so maybe rather than making excuses and trying to buy them off, maybe you just need to take each one of them out and without offering additional commentary, just simply say this. I know it hurt you when I left mom. And I want you to know I'm really sorry. Now that's humility there, guys. And he did it. And you know what? It changed his relationship with his kids to this day. Because what a son or daughter most wants is a honest, humble, open relationship with dad, not trying to avoid the elephant in the room or to buy it off. So if you find yourself in that category, maybe some humility will be just the thing to bridge that gap and create oneness between you and your son or your daughter. Okay, those are two big issues. Now, what I'd like to do, just as I finish here today, is conclude our session by turning from the dad perspective to the son perspective. Because I've been principally talking to you in the category of a dad. Now I want to finish by talking to you in the category of being a son. What do you do, because we've talked about this by looking back, what do you do principally if in growing up you had a dad where things didn't go very well? Maybe you've even been wounded by your dad. And some of you have already felt that in the last few weeks. Do you just live with that? Do you just try and bury the pain? Do you just try to cope with it with various coping mechanisms, some of which maybe even are destructive for you? That's one choice. That's one direction. The other is just simply, and we're in this process together, in this manhood journey, is getting in touch with it and just simply saying, I just need to admit, I was hurt by Dad. I lost things because of our relationship together. I've been wounded. It's kind of our formula that we ended on last week. You name it, you share it, and then you engage it. And to get over a dad wound, you've got to go through that cycle. You've got to say, I was hurt. Maybe tell another friend so you can interact and then go, okay, I need to come up with some ways of engaging. And let's talk about some specific ways you can engage Dad if you feel wounded by him. First, if you're a son wounded by Dad, choose to touch this wound, and I'm going to call it responsibly. Responsibly. And a great place to start with that wound is choose to forgive your dad. Now that's not going to be easy. But let me tell you, a great place to start is, especially with where you are in life, is start looking at your dad as an adult, not as a child. Because if you keep seeing Dad as a child, you'll keep feeling those children perspectives of somebody that was your hero, that hurt you, abused you, put you down, left you, abandoned you, and you're going to just feel only childhood emotions, and you'll just grovel in that. But if you can pull yourself up to where you are today and look at your dad, maybe what you'll see is not Dad who should have been your hero and wasn't, but you'll see a dad who was probably not malicious at all, but himself wounded. You'll see a dad that maybe was misguided. How he grew up maybe ignorant. Maybe he was a casualty of his own father And he carried that because no one ever helped him correct that. And he brought that into the home, and that hurt you. He did bring about hurt in your life, and you could say he messed me up, but he was messed up. That's how an adult sees it. And so you reconcile the fact that he wasn't trying to make your life miserable. I think a great dad statement is what Jesus made on the cross. He was a wounded son, and he's on the cross. And he looks out at the people who put him there, and you know what he says? Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And a good son prayer is this: Father, forgive him. He really didn't know what he was doing. And that's probably really, really true. Choose to forgive your dad. And secondly, you might also just simply choose to release your dad to God. You know, if you, and I'm not saying everybody believes in God in the room, and that's okay, but I'm saying if you do, you've got a God who's going to make things right. And so you can admit you're hurt, but you can also say, I believe that there is going to ultimately be justice and righteousness in my experience. And God will make that happen. I don't have to make it happen. But I need to release myself from this bitterness and pain, and the only way I can do that is just simply forgive my dad as an adult, not as a child. Secondly, if you're a son wounded by dad, don't wait for your dad to come to you. Now guys, everybody look at me. All you sons, dad's probably not going to come to you. That'll be very rare. But if you've been a son wounded by dad, don't wait for him. You go to him. It's going to be a huge, courageous man step for you to go to your dad. But courageously step forward and seek reconciliation with your dad while you can. That'll be one of the most courageous steps you can ever take, but it can be done. In fact, Russell introduced us earlier to his dad in a humorous way, but their relationship was not necessarily that way for many, many years. So I'm going to let Russell just share a personal experience of how he reconciled with his dad. Russell?
Thank you, Robert. You know, as much as my dad loved that electric fence story I told earlier, he loved this next story even more because it's a father and son story. It's a story that changed his life and mine. Really, it's a story about the power of story. Now, it's no secret that growing up, I had a rough relationship with my dad. We were constantly at war with each other, and I blamed it on his anger and how hard he rode me. He blamed it on my troublemaking and my rebelliousness. And years later, we came together and admitted to each other that we were both right. For 25 years, my dad and I butted heads on just about everything until my wife and I and our 2 kids moved 1,600 miles away to Jackson Hole, Wyoming. It was this distance that gave my dad and I a truce, where we just let each other live our lives, but with no real relationship. And then 10 years later, we came home to Little Rock for Christmas, and everything changed. I was 35 and my dad was 65. And it was going to be a special Christmas because my dad's mom, Grandma Freehite, was coming down from Minnesota, which she rarely did. And my daughter, Brittany, was so excited because she and Grandma Freehite loved to talk and laugh and act more like sisters than anything else. On Christmas Eve, everyone was over at my folks' house, and at one point, Grandma Freehite, Brittany, my dad, and I were all sitting around a table with Brittany interviewing Grandma Freehite about her high school boyfriends because Brittany had just recently gotten interested in boys and she was looking for some advice. And it wasn't long before Grandma Freehite started telling the story about her husband, my grandfather, my dad's dad. Now, I didn't know much about this story. All I knew about my grandfather was that he had died when my dad was young. But Grandma Freehite was telling a different story. She was telling Brittany that he hadn't died, but had actually abandoned the family when my dad was 2 years old. I just knew this couldn't be true. I just knew that Grandma Freehite was remembering this wrong somehow. And then I looked over at my dad, and in an instant, I knew it was true. He already had tears streaming down, and his face was racked with pain. This realization explains so much to me. This was the missing link. This was the part of Dad's story that I needed to know. And in an instant, I went from being angry at my dad for all the things that he'd done wrong to being amazed at my dad for all the things that he'd done right. Over the next couple of years, my dad and I walked down a tough, sometimes really tough road to redemption, and we emerged from that journey forever changed as men, as fathers, and as sons. Along the way, I learned that my dad was so ashamed of his dad abandoning the family, my mom didn't even find out until they were married almost 10 years. And most impactfully, I learned that my father had a horrible memory of his dad walking in the house one day, seeing him playing on the floor as a 2-year-old and saying, "You're not worth it," before he walked out, never to be seen again. My dad was 65 years old when he finally surfaced that memory. Now, whether it happened exactly like that or not doesn't really matter, because that 2-year-old boy believed it had. And for 63 years, my dad stuffed the pain of that down deep. He suffered the guilt of believing that if he'd been a better 2-year-old, his mom and brothers and sisters would not have had to suffer so much. As tough as that road was to walk with my dad, we both experienced the forgiveness and restoration that comes from a son knowing his dad's real story. Like I said, this is a story about the power of story, and it's not quite over yet. After my dad and I began experiencing the healing power of me knowing my father's story, we discussed him trying to know more about his father's story. But he was resistant, highly resistant, because he felt to do so would betray his mother and family somehow. But God kept leading them there, and so he faithfully followed. What he found was that his father had volunteered to join the army when World War I broke out. And he was sent off to fight in the fields of France. In that terrible trench warfare, he was gassed with mustard gas. He had a severe head injury. They had to put a metal plate in his head. And he had shell shock, known today as post-traumatic stress disorder. He struggled mightily with his physical and mental health the remainder of his life until he died alone in a VA hospital out in Prescott, Arizona. It was so powerful to watch my dad begin to forgive his dad simply by getting to know his story. He never, for even an instant, minimized the damage his dad had done by leaving the family. Those heartbreaks and hardships were real, and they were devastating. But he began to forgive. He began to be released from the guilt and shame he felt. The final straw for my dad was when he learned that when World War II broke out, his dad tried to re-enlist. He couldn't even take care of himself. His lungs were ravaged from the mustard gas, but he wanted to go once again and fight for his country. That knowledge set my dad on a journey to Prescott, Arizona, where he found his dad's grave. And on that piece of hallowed ground, he laid down his pain. He took a courageous journey to know his father's story, and because of it, he became a free man. You know, my dad made me promise to tell you his story. He knew that it would be hard for me, but he made me promise, not for his benefit, but for yours. He wanted to change your life just like it had changed his and mine. We spent the last 20 years of his life helping other sons know their father's story and watching in awe as it transformed relationship after relationship. Dad just wanted us to do that here again, one more time, together.
Russell's dad was quite a man, and I enjoyed those last years with him as well. What a guy, and what a great story of redemption. And let me tell you, some of you guys, you're going to need to take that journey. You can't wait for Dad. You got to go to Dad, and it is a huge step. And you'll probably need the help of other men to make that actually work through with the interactions that take place. But to finally put that at rest offers you the same freedom that I know Russell has experienced. Third, if you're a son wounded by Dad, If you're a son wounded by dad, risk asking for your dad's love and blessing if you've never received it. Maybe the relationship is just cool, not because dad was necessarily a bad dad or that kind of thing, but he just was never verbal, and you've always wanted just to hear him say, I love you, or I'm proud of you. Here's what I admire in you. And you've never heard that. Okay? Then step up as a man and go ask your dad for those things. I remember saying that to an audience when a young surgeon came down and he said, you know, when I graduated from medical school, I wanted, to go off and practice in another city, and my dad had always wanted me to stay in the family business, was upset that I went into medicine, and when I left, kind of broke off the relationship. And I always felt this estrangement from Dad that he wasn't proud of who I'd become. And so I encouraged him, and with his small group, he went back and talked to his dad. And he asked his dad, Dad, were you proud of me for going to medical school? And it was just the question that the dad needed to finally break the ice back and say to his son, Son, I was always proud of you. You're such a brilliant mind. You're a wonderful surgeon. And I'm so sorry that I didn't affirm you for that move. I was just hurt that you left us in the family business. But it took the move of the son to the dad to bring the dad back to the son. And maybe that's what you need in order to experience your dad's love and blessing in your life. If you hadn't had that, then ask him for it. I remember one guy came down one day and he was 64 years old. His dad was 94 in a nursing home, and all he could do is tell me how his dad had critiqued him and criticized him, and he never measured up. And with the help of a couple other guys in a small group, he went to the nursing home and asked his 94-year-old dad, Dad, do you love me? And his dad said, Well, I love everybody. That doesn't do anything for a son. So Buddy got down in his 94-year-old dad's face and said, Dad, look at me. Grabbed his cheeks and says, No, do you love me? And his dad awkwardly and uncomfortably got it. And his dad said, Buddy, I do love you. And then Buddy told me in the weeks that passed as he'd go see his dad warmed up, kind of got in touch with his own heart. And he said, the crowning moment is when I walked into Dad's nursing home room and his dad said, Buddy, come give Dad a big old hug. Dad had hardly ever touched him. Hugged his son, looked at him and said, Son, I love you. In fact, he said when his dad was just about to die, 15 days in a coma, he was just sitting there by his bedside, stroking his arm. Dad hadn't said a word. He got up to leave and went to open the door, and as he opened the door, he heard a shout behind him. I love you, buddy. And then he died. Now, let me tell you, that was because of the initiative of a son. So if you're a son and you need Dad's blessing, then go ask for it. Let other men encourage you to get you there. And then the last thing as we close is this. If you're a son wounded by Dad, reclaim that relationship you missed by becoming a smart dad. Not general dad, a smart dad for your children. I've told you my story. When I started out as a father, I was clueless. But that's what I did. I created a plan. That plan led to interactions with my kids, us taking individual experiences together, us having conversations around the table about life, me teaching certain skills to my boys, not just sports skills, but life skills, girls, talking those things through, hosting ceremonies for them. And let me tell you, I've never regretted that because it's built a rich relationship between me and my sons and my daughters. And there have been times where I'm grabbing one of my boys and putting my arms around him and he's putting his arms around me and I'm saying, Hey, I love you, Garrett. And Garrett's saying, Dad, I love you. When I'm doing that, I just have this little moment where I go, you know, my dad would have loved that. My dad would have. I don't know what held him back, but we miss so much. But I've been able to reclaim it with my kids. By God's grace, I didn't miss it. And guys, here's what I want you to know as we finish. Don't you miss it either. Be the smart dad, because dad is destiny. You guys have a great week.